bubble. Off. Wow. Off bubble.
Okay.
Or you want that stuff to live, my bubbles both. Start at 2.
That's not good.
Oh, stop it. I don't know. Like that.
Turn it upside down.
Like that.
That's why. Let's try that. That's why. Let's try that. All right. Confirmation. See, Mark Young is here already, our super keener in the class, one of 3 people who are already completed. In fact, all 3 yesterday, I believe, sent their stuff in or completed their exercises. And here we are. Now, I've already done something else here, which is mislabeled this live stream as office hours number 4. It's actually only office hours number 3, but I'll change that in post, as they say. So today, I bet you would. At some point, Mark Young in the comments has said that he'd love to see their answers as well. At some point, I do intend to. It'll be anonymous, of course, but I do intend to put this together maybe into another book or something where I include a lot of the answers, and especially the wrong answers, I would say, are important to include if they're a bit off, because that's how other people in the future will learn. But I may not do that. I may just keep it a course or a courk into infinity and just charge a lot more for it. So for the people that are in it right now, you got a great deal. Because going forward, it's probably going to be a lot more expensive, especially if I keep it as a course. So today, I'm going to try to adhere to about half an hour, unless there's some questions or people show up that have questions. I'm still working on the feedback for everybody that has completed any level of the 3 that have been so far. And so that should be forthcoming this week. I'll try to arrange that so maybe we can all speak live to each one of you if needed. Some I'll just send in a written form depending on what mistakes were made or sort of clarifications or whatever. But today I'm going to cover an important point which is salient for going forward in the courk, which is one of the ways you can test yourself, or like the way you can test yourself in regards to coming up with an armature statement that fits, that you believe fits the piece of media that whether that's a short story or a movie or a episode of a television show. It's to a large degree, it's sort of self-correcting. Because what you do, I'm sure I've mentioned this previously, and Brian has mentioned this, I'm sure too, and everything sort of runs together now, so it's hard to know exactly what's been pointed out sometimes and what's not, so repetition is great. And the way you self-check your work, and the way I've had to do this for the last 10 years, is, let's say, an armature statement would be beauty's only skin deep. Okay? Let's say that's what the story, you believe that's what the story is trying to prove. So when we get that statement, everything in the story needs to fit that statement in one way, shape, or form, right? Now, since it's an argument, there's going to be some people on both sides, right? The main character will be the person, generally speaking, who's going to learn that. So perhaps he or she starts from a place of not realizing that, right? That's one way you could tell the story, is the person thinks beauty's the number one thing that's important. And then by the end of the story realizes that it's only skin deep. It doesn't really tell you anything about a person, a painting. Take your pick of the subject matter, right? You can address it really to most things. And so, for instance, with Jaws, you must face your fears to conquer your fears. It also trickles into every aspect of it. And this is where it gets dicey for people to understand sometimes. So in Jaws, you have Brody, Chief Brody, who's afraid of the water. We know, and see, the characters are created solely on these ideas to represent certain angles on the same idea. So for instance, Chief Brody, we know him and his family come from the city. He's not from the island, and he's afraid of water. And through the course, so his fear is water, which is actually Steven Spielberg's fear that he gave the character of Chief Brody. Also, it was, that's how Spielberg related, because it was in the book. Chief Brody was that character in the book already to some degree. And Spielberg himself was afraid of the water. So, so you see, but Chief Brody, he's a police officer, right? Why? Could he be a mailman? Probably not as good of a choice, right? Because if everyone's afraid, the police officer's job, supposedly, is to protect and serve. To protect, right? So when the killings start, he's the central character because he's supposed to address that. He's supposed to be protecting this new community where he thought he was going to have an easy time compared to the city. We also find that out, right? So he's been drawn into this because there's like no crime in Amity, basically. Kids karate chopping fence posts and whatever. There's very minor, but now this is like a big deal, obviously. And that's another hallmark of a story, is something like, it's life altering, a story. It's not just like, oh, you lost some money. No, it's like the person lost all their money, right? It's like trading places, right? It's not just some guy. It's like a poor black guy, because that's helping you tell the story. It's an extreme, in a way, a version. That gives you that contrast, right? And the two rich white dudes go broke. So the roles are completely flipped. So it's these exaggerations that you're looking for. Obviously, Jaws has a shark that's way bigger than any shark that's ever been caught. So that's another example of that. It's supposed to be the shark in Jaws, the first one, and none of the other movies matter at all. So the first one is 25 feet, I think Quint says, when they're on the boat, right? And Cooper says 20 feet, and he says, no, it's 25, or something like that. So again, the shark itself is exaggerated, right? Now, when you look for this aspect, this armature statement of fear and having to conquer it by facing it, you see that there's a number of people who don't want to face it, right? The mayor, for instance, is a good example of this. He doesn't want to close the beaches, even though people are getting chewed up and spit out, because he's worried, he's fearful of losing all the money. the town generates because it's a tourist town. It's only when finally, he only signs off almost through force when Brody confronts him in the hospital after the kids were in the lagoon and almost got chewed up by the shark, right? They were witness to somebody getting eaten by the shark in the lagoon. And so Brody grabs his hand. But we see in that scene too that the mayor says to Brody, my son was on that beach too. Right? So finally he's sort of come to grips to some degree, but Brody still has to be like, hey, sign this damn thing. When they're going out on the boat and Quentin, Hooper, and Brody are loading stuff on the boat, you see Brody's wife come. She's afraid. Not only for him going out, but she's afraid of Quint. Because Quint's making all these crass songs and jokes. Right? And she says, he scares me. That's one of her lines. And then she runs away. When she leaves the dock area, you see her start to sprint off screen. So it's all these different aspects. If beauty was only skin deep, was the armature statement you were trying to say a certain piece of work fit, you would look for all these ways. Are the characters behaving? Is what they're saying and doing a representation of that? And is the plot, the setting, right? Jaws is mostly spent on the water, whether it's before they go out on the boat, whatever. It's all around the water, because really it's the water. The shark itself is just a representative, just giving the water teeth, as people have said. Maybe Brian McDonald. You find the same thing with a movie called The Ghost in the Darkness, with Val Kilmer and Michael Douglas, which was based on a true story where they were trying to build a railroad across Africa and these two lions kept killing the workers and stuff. It's the same thing. In that situation, you're giving the land teeth, basically. Because they're basically trying to colonize and drive this, increase the commerce of Africa and get the railroad put in. So the land itself, its agents, the lions, are out killing the workers to stop the railroad. Same thing with Jaws. It's the water essentially killing people, and that's why it's such a brilliant start to Jaws, because you see the girl is attacked by the shark, but we never see the shark. In fact, we don't see the shark for an hour and 20 minutes or something. Really, there's what you see him underwater when he gets that guy in the lagoon briefly, which is the best shot you have of him before Brody is chumming, and that leads to the bigger boat thing. That's the first time you really see Jaws. And then you see him a lot after that, for the last third of the movie or whatever. So that's how you test it. So if you have this idea, every scene has to fit that idea. That's the only reason that scene exists, is to try to help put across that idea and to advance it closer to the climax, where we're going to prove, if the example is beauty's only skin deep, that will be proven at the climax, right? We see in Jaws, Brody literally faces down the shark. They come face to face. It's funny because he even says, smile, you son of a, right? Which is something you do with your face. So it's really good about how tight, and there's literally no filler. When you come across filler in television shows and movies and stuff, it's not a story, because they've had no plan. They don't know what they're trying to say, and as a result, they just push stuff happening. Well, one of the podcasts I think you've already listened to so far is one where Brian talks about, it's not what could happen in a story. That's the way a lot of people approach it. What could happen? We could make the main character do this. We could make them do that. We can make them go here. That's not how a story functions, though. It's what should happen. So in the case of The Beauty's Only Skin Deep, whoever the main character is, they're going to find that out over the course of the movie, or the short story, or the novel, or whatever. And it's going to be this to a certain degree. There's going to be some, is it? Isn't it? there's going to be some obstacles that seem to reinforce that beauty's, not skin deep. And then the other way, and finally, ultimately, it'll be proven at the end that is skin deep. And a way, sort of a classic example of that is somebody, a beautiful person turns out to be vacuous and immoral, for example. Right? That could be the climax. You find out the person that is the most gorgeous person in the thing is a terrible person. So that's something to look for as you're going through it. If you have an idea for what you think the story might be trying to say, you try to get it into that proverb form, that sort of pithy sentence that sort of captures what's trying to be said, the armature statement, and then test it against all aspects. Right? We spend all the time on the water because Brody's afraid of the water. Right? And then we incorporate people who are water-based. You got the marine biologist. You got the shark fisherman. Right? Because Brody's afraid of the water. So where do you... This is something Brian McDonald talks about in regards to the land of the dead. Right? The character must go to the land of the dead to get the wisdom. And it's usually you put the character into their form of hell. So in Jaws, for example, Brody's afraid of the water. He literally has to go out in the water for like the last third of the movie on a boat, and then the boat sinks and he's in the water with the shark, right? So it's like, and then he faces his fear finally and destroys the shark, survives, and then at the very end says, I used to be afraid of the water. Where they're kicking, him and Hooper are kicking back home on the barrel the makeshift sort of barrel pontoon thing they made from the remnants of the Orca. So with other television shows and stuff, if you think it's a certain statement, you've come up with a statement that you think the thing is trying to convey, try to match it to all the scenes, the settings, what the characters say. Now sometimes, and this is probably one of the exercises in the upcoming chapter, I think. Again, it sort of all runs together, but I think this is the exercise in chapter 4 coming up, which is, if you're struggling with what the thing is, what you think it's trying to say, really what you do is, and this is the way I sort of approach it, I guess, or used to approach it, more or less, was come up with like the subject, like what is this about? Is it about, like in the case of Beauty is Only Skin Deep, you would probably think, I think you had to do some of these exercises already too with regards to soft research, but beauty, right? That would be the sort of overarching subject matter. If a story was trying to say beauty's only skin deep, it would be based on beauty. That would be like the 10,000 foot view. And then you'd have to sort of try to hone it into what is it saying about beauty. So that's one way to sort of approach it if you're struggling, is to say, what is the general topic here? This is what people often misdiagnose as the theme. They think, oh, beauty is the theme of this, or family is the theme of this, but those can't be themes because you can't prove those things. And you need to prove, what about beauty? What about fear? What about family? Right? So that's the theme. That's the armature statement, is the sentence. So because it's a specific angle on those things that you're trying to prove, and that is the survival information that's being conveyed, which is the important reason stories are so important. They're conveying things that will actually help you live. So in regards to, like, face your fear and conquer your fear, that's a pretty obvious one. But beauty's only skin deep, right? So that tells you basically to investigate beyond just the superficial in regards to beauty in that case. So that's how you test yourself, and then you take that 10,000. If you're struggling with trying to come up with the sentence, you start with the 10,000 foot view, right? There are more important things than money. Another, classic proverb. You'd start with money, maybe greed, with, depending on what the story was you were trying to analyze. Um, some of this is, you know, some of these exercises you've done so far where you're required to watch the same thing over and over again. The primary, which I explain, I think, in the courk, but the primary reason you're doing that is you want to be so familiar, you want to be so bored with something in a way. And you know it so well because you've seen it. You know, it's almost best to watch it like one after another, like, you know, one whole week. Like if I have you watch The Last Jedi or Jaws 5 times in 3 weeks, it's almost better to watch it, you know, 5 days in a row. Because what you're trying to do is force yourself to become so familiar with it that the story itself isn't sucking you in as hard. You're starting to, and every time you rewatch it, you'll see different things. And then because you're studying it and not just watching it, you're looking for certain things, and then hopefully those things will reveal themselves easier the more times you watch it, because you know where it's going. So there's no surprises, right? Surprise is often used in storytelling to pull you forward, and cliffhanging, open loops, all these things, mysteries, which is a form of open loop, foreshadowing, right, which is another form of open loop. So what you have to do is almost get bored with something before you can really start to study it, because then you're going to no longer notice the stuff you notice when you're just an audience member. You start to analyze the deeper structure, and that's when you can really start to see how things are put together. So like Jaws is one of the best examples, which is why this courk is based around it. You see how delineated the characters are, right? Brody, the 3 main characters, but the main character, Brody, and the 2 partners that end up on the boat with him, Hooper and Quint, vastly different characters, right? But as you go through, you see that they each become afraid. Now, in Hooper's case, he goes down in the cage. You see him, because that's one of their last, you know, what can we do? What can you do? Can you poke him with that poison? Is that, you know, because they've run out of options. Quint's destroyed the engine from trying to run away from the shark. So then he says to Hooper, what can you do with that poison? But he has to go down in the cage, and you see when Hooper is about to be lowered in the cage and he's trying to clean his mask, he says, "I have no spit." He's afraid. That's why he can't conjure any saliva. He's afraid. Now Hooper goes down in the cage anyways and lives. Right? So that's another representation of the fact that he did face his fear and he lived. Now, in the making of Jaws, that was a bit of an accident. They had, like in the book, Hooper dies. And in the original screenplay, I believe they had him earmarked for death. But because the way they filmed some live footage in the small cage with the guy, there was originally a little person that was supposed to go in the cage to give it, the shark footage, a dimension that they wanted, where the shark's supposed to be 25 feet and the person's supposed to be a certain scale to that. But because the little person didn't want to do it and didn't want to do the footage, and the cage got all smashed up with some of the footage they used in the movie, you see where it gets caught in the top of the cage or whatever. It was because at that point the cage was empty. The guy wouldn't go down in it. And they got the stuff of Hooper swimming away. They had to shoehorn that in because, so the original intention was for Hooper to get murdered, I believe, by the shark. But that would have been the wrong move, actually, because that doesn't fit the story being told. That would break the story. So the fact that he goes to face it and lives was kind of a happy accident because of the circumstances of the arduous making of that film, but is the correct choice. Whereas Quint, who tries to run away, tries to hold on to Brody when the ship is sinking and the shark is on the, launched itself onto the back of the boat. He's doing everything in his power to escape, and he escaped previously from the sharks during the sinking of the Indianapolis, which is why he's gone on this shark murdering spree when we meet him, right? He's shark, the premier shark catcher in Amity. But he becomes afraid when the shark takes the third barrel underwater, which had never happened. Hooper says to him, has this ever happened before? Has the shark ever behaved like this? He says no. And that's when Quint becomes afraid, and that's when he decides to try to go back to land, and he's pushing the boat and the engine blows because he's trying to run away. And as a result, he's kicking and trying to get away from the shark when he's sliding down the back of the boat, and that's why he's killed, because he ultimately doesn't really face it. He's trying to get away the whole time once he becomes afraid. And so he loses his life as a result because he didn't legitimately face his fear, right? Whereas Brody, like Hooper, faces it directly and survives, which proves the point. So that's a real important aspect, is to try to, your ability to self-check it. So like when those, I think you guys have read an O. Henry story called The Green Door. Was the last chapter, was there a Mary Shelley story maybe that I put in there? Like I said, it all sort of runs together. But when you're trying to check your work, or you're thinking about what these stories might be about, and you're, take it and look at the different scenes, the different plot elements, the different characters, and compare them to what you think the movie's trying to say. And often that may jog, may spark something or give you a new perspective, because it may or may not fit that. And if it doesn't fit that, then it's probably not that. And then you have to sort of maybe go through that 10,000 foot view again, where you're like, okay, what is this about generally? And then sort of narrow it depending on the events and the characters and the settings. So it doesn't look like we have any questions today. Mark was on, is still probably likely on here. Most people don't show up for these things, which is fine by me. Which means you either don't have questions, are too afraid to ask, or you're just trying to get through the stuff, and maybe if some real obstacle presents itself, then you'll ask a question then. So I think that's it's fine, because I'm going to talk for at least half an hour on these office hours, and it's here for you as a resource for anyone who wants to. Even people who are not in this is public on my YouTube channel, so even people who are not in the course, if they have any questions about the course. Could you recommend a book of short stories? Okay, Mark has a question. Yes, I can. I can recommend many, but I will try to single some out. In fact, my partner, my girlfriend, just bought me a book of short stories, and she probably has it sitting over there. Hey, babe. Oh, she can't hear me. I don't think she's got her headphones in. What you want to look for is anthologies. So I think that one that she just bought for me, which was the actual paper and ink version she got from a secondhand store, is the Norton Anthology of Short Stories. But Stephen King has several short story collections. Isaac Asimov has several short story collections. O. Henry has several short story collections. And most of the O. Henry ones for certain can be found for free on the internet. If you go to places like Z Library or Anna's Archive or stuff like that, or archive.org even, what you want is an anthology, because typically, because stories are short stories are short, more or less, although they span a pretty wide range. The ones I tend to read are all over the place. Now, I have found, in my experience dealing with armature for 10 years, that a lot of flash fiction, which is 1,000 words or under, is almost never a story, for whatever reason. Probably because most people don't understand armature, they've never heard of it, they don't know what their story's about, they're just, writing a couple of scenes, right? He bought awful ones. Yeah, I've read a lot of, but so as of today, let me just look, because I've been reading short stories now every day and multiple. This year, starting January through July, I read 2 a day. Right now I'm at 1,039 was the last night's was the 1,039th, but I read 2 a day, so it's a couple years plus worth of reading at least one short story every day. But from January this year till July sometime when I was up in New York, I read 2 a day to try to get to that 1,000 mark, and I've read 1 a day since. Now also, you could read the Grimm's fairy tales. You could read the Andrew Lang fairy tale books. You could read Aesop's fables, of course, some of which you may encounter more in the courk as we go along. Some of these you'll encounter. Yeah, I would recommend the Night Shift by Stephen King would be one. And Isaac Asimov was involved with a series of people where they made a whole bunch of anthologies of like science fiction. So if you try to look up, I think his name is Hank Greenberg, is one of the producers and editors of these anthologies. So if you look up his name, you'll see that he was like the editor or the producer of all these fantasy, sci-fi, mystery anthologies. And Asimov, some of which you'll encounter later in the course, he wrote a bunch of short stories about this group of like kind of lay people detectives called the Black Widows. And you'll have to read some of those stories upcoming. So once you see some of the ones, you know, a good sort of hallmark is to take a look at the people I've singled out to include in the course, and then go find more of their stuff. That is the way to do it. And you'll see Stephen King and Asimov. Did I include an Asimov thing yet? I don't think so, but upcoming. Also Rod Serling, of course. All the Twilight Zone episodes were put into book form. What's interesting is like a lot of the ones after he passed away, his wife put out a few more books, but like a lot of those aren't stories. She commissioned a bunch of people like on the 50th anniversary and stuff to like write about, I know, new short stories for the Twilight Zone, but a lot of those aren't stories. Kind of like the new Twilight Zone television shows that came after Serling was no longer involved. They're not really stories. So yeah, and of course, usually the further you go back, the better your chances are. So if you go back and read Twain or like I said, O. Henry, Mary Shelley. I don't know how many short stories Mary Shelley actually wrote. But yeah, obviously, you know, you'll have to do a bit of a treasure hunt. But I just picked, when I was reading my one short story a day, I just picked a bunch of anthologies. And I would jump around. Because one of the things I was trying to do by reading, one of the things I am trying to do by reading a bunch of short stories all over the place, is I grab anthologies and I just go randomly pick a story out of there. Sometimes based on the length and stuff, like can I read this in half an hour? And because I want to find people, and I have found people, some of which you'll meet as the course goes on. I've found people I've never heard of who are great at storytelling, whose work is as good as the Asimovs, the O. Henrys, the Spielbergs, but never heard of them because they either, they just weren't that popular. They were writing in genres that weren't that popular, they were writing Western stories, or they were writing fantasy stories or something that wasn't as popular as like murder mysteries or whatever, But yeah, King Night Shift, and I think there's another one, and a lot of there's a ton of Isaac Asimov ones where they slapped him and all his sci-fi contemporaries, into these short story. There's also ones that are like short stories. So I know there's some Asimov ones, which is how I first started reading Asimov. I picked up a book that just had really short, like exceptionally short stories, like they were probably closer to flash fiction, but more in like the 2,000 to 3,000 range maybe. word range. And then in the preface to one of those books, he was talked about how stories are supposed to have a point. And then what was interesting was a lot of those stories in that anthology didn't have a point, but his did. And so far, aside from his early career, all the short stories I've read for Asimov, you know, have a reason for being told, and not for just entertainment purposes. They have an armature statement, and often, and the first thing that really piqued my interest about Isaac Asimov actually was there's a story which I'll share in the Cork, I think eventually, where it's a pun. He was big on puns, and so maybe of all the great writers, Asimov might have the best sense of humor and the best humor writing in regards to people who understand storytelling. He might be the best at humor. That was one thing Rod Serling wasn't great at, was humor. Apparently he was quite funny as a person, but couldn't make that translate to the page, which is interesting unto itself. Yes, a stitch in. Yes, that's the Mark Young in the comments. So yeah, that pun. The stitch in time, whatever the proverb is. I think, was that in, did I use that story already in Saturday Secrets? Right? That was see, that's a really interesting, that's what really got me reading a lot of Asimov, was that punny title and the punny outcome of that time travel story about the guy committing the bank robbery or whatever it was. Right? So, in fact, Asimov has put out books on damn near everything, it seems like. Real science books for children, science books for adults, all sorts of fiction. Great books about Shakespeare, the Bible. I mean, he really seemed to know what he was doing, because he would really dissect and get into what's happening in some of these classic texts. But he also put out, books of limericks. And apparently in person, allegedly, was kind of a lecherous old man. So take that for what it's worth. But writing-wise, he seemed to never miss. Once he got, I'm doing something right now with Asimov that I haven't sort of put it off for the meantime while all this is going on. But with Asimov and Stephen King and a couple other people, I've been starting from their first story that was ever published, working forward to see when they sort of started to implement, and started to hone their work into armature, because neither of them started out that way, which is an interesting thing. And I also read Stephen King's son's work, a little bit of it so far, not much, but it doesn't seem to me that he knows how to tell a story either, which is interesting. So it means his father did not really directly explain it to him, or is not a good teacher perhaps, or Joe wasn't interested in learning from his, maybe there's a contention there, I don't know. But from what little I've read, which is 3 or 4 of Stephen King's son stories, he doesn't know how to tell a story, which is, such an interesting thing in a way, where probably the greatest living writer, their son can't tell a story. Very interesting. I think that's about it for today. We've gone about 38 minutes here, so if there's no further questions, I think Mark has had a good one. But if there's no other questions, tomorrow, chapter 4 and its exercises will come out at 1 o'clock p.m. Central Standard Time. And for those of you who have, I think there's half of you have completed chapter 3 and are maintaining in lockstep with these releases. For the other 3 of you, of course, you're at various stages of completing the exercises from the earlier chapters. Keep plugging along. It's not a race. I want you to give it the time that you think it deserves, and or if you're struggling, feel free to reach out. Even these office hours are here every 3 weeks for your questions and stuff, but you can ask me anytime. D'Artagnan Magic, of course, at gmail.com. You can ask any question you want about anything. I may not have the answer, but with my 51 plus years on this planet, I'll probably have some place I can direct you if I don't know myself. Help you get that answer, if one said if an answer exists. So without any further questions, thanks to everyone. Hope this is a benefit to you as you work through the cork. It gives a better idea of what the cork is about for those of you who are interested in taking it in the future. Until then, we'll see you next time. We'll see you in 3 weeks.